Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Maya Basuk. I am the director and producer of webinars here at Bespoke Education, and I'm so happy to have you here with me today for another webinar in our free webinar series. We've been doing these for more than a year now, just working to get helpful, useful information out there for all of you, just to try and answer some of the common questions students and parents have about the many steps on the educational journey. So I'm very excited for today's webinar, Demystifying the ACT Science section. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to introduce you briefly to Bespoke Education and give you a bit of an understanding about what we do here. So I'm just going to share my screen. So we are a full service test prep and educational company based in New York City. And we've been developing our expertise here for almost 20 years. And we're realizing more and more what a national and even international reach we've developed. We offer a full slate of academic and personal educational services throughout any child's academic journey. So that starts with tutoring. We've been working for almost 20 years to really refine our understanding of what makes good tutoring, to train our tutors with the most up-to-date information, pedagogical information, and to really refine our understanding of how we can best help students at every step on the academic journey. So our tutors are trained in academic support, in test prep, organizational and study skills, executive functioning skills. We've got admissions advising and college essay coaching, and our tutors work with students both in person and online. Next, we also offer a variety of independent classes, summer boot camps and intensives, and seminars and classes throughout the year, as well as seminars and classes in partnership with schools and organizations throughout the New York metro area. So we've got our full fall course catalog here. I encourage you to check it out. Here are some examples of the courses that we offer throughout the school year. And if you like this presentation and you're interested in bringing one of our informational webinars or perhaps a class to your school or PTA, please reach out to us. Sarah's got our contact information in the chat, and we are happy to organize that with you. So we also work with K-5 students in a variety of formats. We started a pod last year during the pandemic, and we're continuing with K-5 pods this year, as well as offering some after-school academic enrichment for elementary age kiddos. Next is mock testing. We do mock tests for all the standardized tests, both in person and in our offices in person in our offices and online. So for folks looking ahead to standardized test prep, mock testing is a key component of standardized test prep. As our head of tutoring likes to say, you have to practice these tests like you play them. So it's very important for students to get the experience of taking a full test in a testing setting. And we're actually an industry leader in the mock testing realm. We offer these tests not just to our own students, but to students of other private tutors, even students from other tutoring companies. So let's see, and even students from other schools across the country. Next is webinars. I've already spoken a little bit about our webinars, but you can find links for future webinars up on our website, and you can also sign up to receive notifications every time we have a new webinar coming up. You can subscribe to our mailing list, and we also have recordings of past webinars, so I would encourage you to check those out. And you will be receiving a recording of this webinar as well, so in your inboxes in the next few days, and you are welcome to share that with friends, family, anyone who might be interested. So unlike other tutoring companies, we also focus on pro bono work with an initiative called Bespoke Education Access. So Bespoke Education Access is a way for us to offer low and no cost tutoring and classes at deserving schools and to students that need it. So we've developed some long-lasting school and community partnerships, and this helps us support our long-term goals of equity and access in education. And last but certainly not least, we just know test prep. We've been a test prep tutoring company for almost 20 years now, and we do a lot of it. We do one-on-one tutoring, and we do test prep classes, including test prep for the college admissions exams, ACT and SAT, like we're going to talk about today, but also for the high school admissions exams, like the IC, SSAT, SHSAT, and the Hunter test, as well as for AP exams and for postgraduate exams like the GMAT, GRE, etc. So if you have any questions about any of this, please give us a call. If something interests you, or if you're not sure what kind of support your child might need, but you just want to have a conversation, our team is more than happy to chat with you and advise you on the next steps on your child's academic journey. And these calls are free and they are extensive. So please reach out, give us a call, email us. We're more than happy to help. So, demystifying the ACT science section. I would love to invite my friends and panelists for this webinar, Dan and Riley. Dan, Riley, would you please join us and introduce yourselves and talk to us a little bit about your background in test prep and what this, why this topic interests you?
Sure. Thank you, Maya. And thank you for the introduction. So my name is Dan. I'm the head of tutoring here and the COO. I've been at Bespoke a long time. I started here in the fall of 2006, and I started out doing test prep tutoring with the SAT and the ACT, and then the biology subject test, in fact, which is no longer a test that is offered. But I've been doing it. I've been transitioning in the last maybe 5 or 6 years to working more with the Bespoke tutors than with the Bespoke students. And I do a lot of training and hiring and just working with the tutors to develop their craft, to standardize the training that we do, to make sure the tutors are bringing the best and the latest in their work with their students. And that's part of what I'm here for, is that I actually really like the ACT test. It's a very interesting test. It's really well crafted. And there's some really important ways that students and families need to learn to think about it. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of that specifically on the ACT science with you all today. Riley?
Hi, everybody. My name is Riley. I'm a tutor with Bespoke. I've been working with Bespoke for 2 years and been tutoring many years before that. I mostly work with a lot of the kids that are very strong in like reading and writing and don't necessarily love math. So I try to show them the cool, fun side of math and how it can also be fun and artistic. But I took the ACT when I was in high school as well. And like Dan says, I really enjoyed the way the test is structured, and remember also having some trepidation about the science section when I was a high schooler. So I can understand where a lot of my students are coming from and help them achieve their highest aspirations in this section.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Riley. It's really great to hear kind of like your approach to this, your personal approach to this test. And I definitely think each individual tutor, brings something different to their students and to each test. So I'm excited for you all to see kind of how these guys approach the test and how they tutor it. Before we jump in, I do have some logistics for our attendees. So we do have a poll. So if you could please answer that poll, and then once you've answered it, just X out of it. And please send us your questions as they come up. You can either send those in the Q&A, either anonymously or under your own name. You have an option to select anonymous, or you can directly chat us if you feel more comfortable doing so that way. Sarah, our tutoring services associate, and myself will do our best to answer your questions in real time. And if we don't get to them, then Dan and Riley will answer them at the end of the webinar. And let's see. And as I mentioned before, the webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you afterwards. So please don't feel the need to write down everything you hear. And we are a word of mouth company. So yeah, if you like what you hear today, please spread the word, tell your friends and family. You can even share the recording link and let people know about us, because it really helps. So Dan, Riley, take it away.
Let's go for it. Thank you, Maya. So this is a section, the ACT science, that's on everyone's mind whenever they embark on the test prep journey. And it's one of the things that maybe they've heard some scary stories about, or it's different. And that's true. It is a different section. It's different from other standardized test sections that students may have taken. And it's certainly different from any other section on the ACT test or the SAT test. And we get a lot of questions about it. And our students typically have more trouble on the ACT science than they do on other sections of these tests. So we decided we would spend a whole webinar just talking about the ACT science, trying to share with you some useful information, but also some of our tips about how to approach it. And it is a challenging section, but the key is it is actually one of the most tutorable, or let's say improvable sections on either of the SAT or the ACT. It really is something that if you can think about it slightly differently, think about it in the right way, you're going to be able to make a big improvement. And so that's part of what we want to share with you today. We're going to talk facts, first of all, just to kind of give you the lay of the land. Then we're going to talk about strategies, both from like strategies that we share with students, but also strategies that we share with tutors when we're training them for the ACT. And then lastly, we're going to try something we've never tried before in one of these webinars, which is kind of a demo lesson where, and actually two of them, where Riley is going to teach me playing the student, and then I'm going to teach Riley playing the student. And we're just going to kind of share and walk you through, talk you through how we need to approach these passages on the ACT science to really do it in the successful way. So first piece of that is the facts. We got to kind of give you the lay of the land before we dive in there. So Riley, can you tell me, how does this test work? What's the shape of it? How does the rest of the test, please expound.
Yeah, so the ACT has 4 sections. We're going to see science at the very end. This section is going to have 40 questions, 35 minutes. So if you do the math here, a little bit about a minute per question-esque, and that tends to be a time crunch for some students. So a lot of this test is about moving quickly, getting through the section. Your student's going to see about 6 to 7 passages. One is the conflicting viewpoints, which I will be teaching later. You're going to be seeing 5 to 6 questions per passage. The passage types you'll see. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention there are going to be 4 multiple choice answers per question. So what's the nice thing is that there's not going to be anything they're going to have to fill out and put in their own answer. Everything's going to be multiple choice. The types of passages that you will see are data representation. These ones, as we have examples here, are ones that have a lot of tables, graphs. It's your students going to be looking for information that's just being presented to them. The next one is going to be research analysis. That's where you have either one experiment that's broken down into 2 parts, or maybe one experiment that was redone by somebody else, a mixture of looking at hypotheses, information, and the scientific process. And then finally, the last one, conflicting viewpoints, where we have scientists giving their different hypotheses, and your student will be asked to compare and contrast and look at how different new evidence might support one scientist or refute another. One of the reasons why we wanted to introduce the types of passages, and why I usually go over this with students, is because sort of the big tips of a passage type will be, we want your student to be able to recognize what type of passage they're in, right? If they can see what type of passage there is, or that they're in the test, then they can use a different skill set to approach it. So being able to recognize it first will help them solve the problem faster. The other thing is, I don't want my students to get overwhelmed. The ACT science section is very good at throwing a lot of information at you, but you don't need to understand everything. So when you see that you're doing a data representation question, you might recognize, I don't need all this data, and you don't actually have to understand everything. Finally is, you can do the passages out of order. Some of my students are really, really good at doing the data representation, but may struggle with the research analysis. So if the research analysis comes up, they recognize, oh, this is a research analysis passage, not my strength. I would suggest they skip it, come back to that passage. Right? They can play to their strengths and weaknesses if they know what they're going up against.
One nice piece about this test being a standardized test is that it's standardized. And that means while the passages themselves will be different from test to test, and actually the ACT works very hard to make sure that every time a student is sitting for it, they're seeing new material. The structure of the passages and the structure of the ACT science test as a whole is always going to be the same. So that becomes something that you can rely on and comfortably expect, rather than feeling like you're just kind of at the whim of random or just crazy decision making. So that's something that we really want students to get familiar with. And that extends even to the question types. And I'm going to talk about that, where one of the things you want to do as you're preparing for this test is become familiar with the question types. So if you see a question type, you recognize what kind of a question it is, and then you have a better idea more automatically of what you need to do to respond to it. So some of these question types that you're going to see and that you're going to become familiar with. You're going to see spotting trends questions, where you've got to look at data or look at fields on a graph, and you've got to be able to interpret or read which way the data is going. Is it going up or down, or is it random, or is it an inverse relationship, or something like that? The next kind of question is called a lookup question, where basically you've got to just take the question and then go back to the information that was presented, find what you need to find, and then bring it back to the question and answer it. The third kind is a scientific method question. This is where you do need to understand the scientific method. In a minute, we're going to talk about what science you have to know and what science you don't have to know. And that's very important. But the scientific method is good. You should know that. You should know how you can pose a question as a hypothesis and then test it with your experiments or with your trials. The third kind of question that you're going to see is an inference question, which is kind of like taking a spotting trends question and extending it, where you're given some information and then using logic, you have to infer what might happen to that information if something else happened. So there is another step involved, but it's usually very simple and straightforward logic. So the more you practice it, the more you're going to be able to see that more quickly. Then we've got hypothesis questions, which are essentially, how does a hypothesis work? Testing one hypothesis against another, or thinking about what evidence or what data might prove or disprove a hypothesis from a scientist. And we're going to see that definitely when we work on Riley's lesson. Then lastly, you've got combo or synthesis questions, where basically these are putting some information together and then drawing out from there. These are probably the most challenging, just because you've got to keep the most in your mind when you are working on them. And that's a big piece of the overall strategies that we're talking about here, is how much you keep in your mind and how you control that. Because this test is great at overwhelming you with information. If we can flip back 2 or 3 slides to one of those questions, just to give our audience a vision of how much information you've got, that would be great. Maya, can you go back a slide or 2, just to see some of these question types? There's a huge amount of information. It's just enormous. Look how much you have to read. One more slide. There's 3 big paragraphs. There are 2 charts, a paragraph, 4 graphs. It is a ton of information. And if you try to understand it all, you're just going to get overwhelmed. Riley, you had a great metaphor or way of thinking about this with your students. But can you run that by us?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about is being able to just look at one piece of information at a time and trying to connect it to the piece. And so I would say it's like you're trying to put together a puzzle, but you're holding all the pieces at once, right? That's not how we do puzzles. We don't hold every single 500 piece or every part of the 500 piece puzzle in our hands and try to build it all at the same time. We lay everything out in front of us. We pick up one piece, figure out where it might fit in the puzzle, and then look for another piece and see if they connect together, right? That's all we have to do, one piece at a time, and eventually the whole picture gets put together. And that's really the best way I find to approach this section.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a couple of tips just for the question types, and then we're going to move on to some of these bigger strategies. So some question types, ideas to think about is skipping questions that you can skip, that's a piece of it, and that you can choose what order you go in. Sorry, we're mixing up on the slides here a little bit. Those are just some types. We're going to come back to those tips as we go. So Riley, talking about questions, we're talking about choosing questions to order, choosing what order you answer them in, but that does come back to thinking about scoring. So let's talk through scores before we move on to the big strategies.
Great, yeah. So just like the rest of the ACT, this section is scored out of 36 overall. Each question is worth exactly the same, which is why we've been saying pick what to skip, because there's no favorites of questions. None of them are going to be worth more points than others. So if you're having a hard time, skip it. Go find the easy points first, then come back to it. There's also no wrong answer penalty. So I always advise every student, even if you don't know, put something down, put down a guess. The one caveat for this section, I would say each science question is weighted more than the English or math questions. And that's just because there are fewer of them, right? And so because of that, if you do miss one question, it could change your percentile a bit more than one in the math or the English section would. You could go, if you had a 36 perfect score and you missed one question, it's possible to go down to a 34 or 35, 34, even 33 sometimes, depending on the weight that's been put on that test. That being said, though, and yes, we have this lovely, this visual here as to how just missing a couple questions could change your score. That being said, most, I would say, college admissions committees, they know that this section of the ACT is the hardest. And so they tend to give a little more understanding to the score of the science section, especially seeing how easy it is to drop a couple points in this section as well. So that tends to calm some of the fears of both my students and their parents when we talk about this section as well.
Cool. So something that we see, we're talking about skipping questions, we're talking about choosing the questions that work to your benefit, choosing the questions that don't. So there's definitely a benefit to being familiar with the test. The more that you can recognize how difficult a question is before you set out on answering it, the better that's going to serve you. So this is a test which really rewards practice. However, there are some pieces of science that you just do need to know. We have some students who come in and they say, you know, I've never been a big fan of science, or a parent might tell us, my student's never been a great science student, so should we just not even look at it? My recommendation is always, you should at least give it a try, because you can get very far with not too much science knowledge. This test was actually called a science reasoning test before it was now, as it is now, called the science test. And it still is a science reasoning test where you don't really need to know most of the science, most of the scary terms, most of the intimidating scientific phrases that appear on it. What you need to think of them as is a stand-in for something. The data, the other pieces of the science passage give you the information you need. Don't think of them as something that you've got to understand before you proceed to answering those questions. But every test, there are 1 or 2 or 3 questions where you do need to know some science. That doesn't mean you're sunk if you don't know it, because as we showed before, there are some questions that you can skip and still get a very good score. Riley, can you talk us through some of the science pieces that you do need to know, or that it would serve you to be familiar with as you embark on preparing for the test?
Yeah, definitely. The first thing, always scientific method that I go over with my students, knowing hypothesis, independent and dependent variables, things like that. It is helpful to know acids and bases, how they fit on the pH scale, parts of atoms, what an ion is, proton, neutrons, electrons, photosynthesis, right? Just being familiar with these. You don't need to be an expert on photosynthesis. You should just probably know what photosynthesis is. The biggest thing though, I'd say metric system. That's always what I find with my students is just, they're not used to the metric system. So they don't know the difference necessarily between a meter and a kilometer. We will go over metric system and other differing units of measurement, whether that be, like we say on here, depth, volume. I find a lot of it being temperature, Celsius, Fahrenheit, concentration, knowing how a gas is concentrated, things like that. However, one tip or trick that I do give for my students, even if they don't know stuff, sort of a knowledge branch that's outside of science that ends up being useful is going over your Greek and Latin roots. This may also be because I tend to get the writing artsy kids that love to read, and so they have a little bit of knowledge of Greek and Latin roots. Because if you know some of those roots and understand them, then the big sciencey words that you might not know the exact definition of, you can get an idea about. We have an example, this next example coming up with showing mitosis, right? The division of cells. And my student might not know what mitosis is and all the parts of mitosis. That might not be something that they have learned yet. They may not have taken biology. However, if we saw this question and we were working through it together and we were looking at for question 2, I might say, okay, it's asking which cell in this figure represents prophase, but we can kind of understand what the word pro might mean as a, yes, thank you for showing it on question 2, but we can see what that root of pro might mean and understand that it's the beginning, it's the first phase, and then looking at these pictures, try to figure out which one looks like it's in the first phase of division. So I really do find the Greek and Latin roots to be helpful, really helpful for a lot of my students.
Cool. So we've talked you through what the shape of the test is, a little bit of what it looks like, passages and questions, and how you might need to know some science. But we once again want to stress that you really don't need to know that much science. And that's how we're going to begin talking and working with our students. So Riley, you're going to share now some strategies. How do you begin talking about this test with your students so they're ready to dive in the way that you want them to?
Yeah, when I begin with a new student, the first question I always ask when we're starting the science section is just, what science have you taken and how do you feel about it? Because I've rarely found a student that hated every science they took. There's usually a science that is intriguing to some of my students, or they liked it maybe just a little bit more than everything else, right? And so we'll start there. I try to get them in a place that's familiar and exciting to them, because we really want to make sure that they are getting a foothold in the strategies and also not wearing themselves out, especially when they go actually take the real ACT. I will have a student that, I had a student that was a cross-country runner, and I was giving this anecdote of saying like, okay, well, I grew up doing a swim team, and imagine we're doing a triathlon, right? If we're doing a triathlon, would really like to start swimming first because I like swimming and I want to do it when I have the most energy. You would probably like to go running first because that's what you do best. When we approach the ACT science section, if I have a student that loves physics, I would say, go through the section, look for the physics one and start there. Also because we can, as we say, switch up the orders, skip what we don't necessarily think is our strongest suit. The final thing though that I definitely say right off the bat with every student is you can for sure answer correctly, even if you don't know the science. And we've said that before over and over again today, but just getting away from this idea of starting at the beginning, working to the end, but instead working through what looks familiar and then using their techniques to get the best score possible after that.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about choosing questions, and what we're really getting at here is the idea of cognitive load. And if that's an unfamiliar term, I'll just describe it very briefly. It's essentially how much information your brain is taking in and then how much you have to do with it. And a lot of the strategies that we're putting out there are all about controlling cognitive load, looking at less so your mind is not quite so overwhelmed, it can focus, it can work clearly, and it can proceed to the next challenge with some energy conserved. Because this is a challenging test, absolutely. But if you can control what you're looking at, it goes okay. So some other pieces that we are talking about, some things that I talk about with tutors when I'm training them to get them ready to tutor our students on this test. One big thing is what I call thinking piece by piece. And this is similar to what Riley was saying with that puzzle piece metaphor, is that if you try to read the whole passage and then read each graph, understand each table, understand the charts and the diagrams, and then go on to the questions, you're doing it wrong because you're trying to think of everything. You're trying to understand everything. And that is, I mean, maybe it's possible for somebody, but probably not for me. I mean, I know it's not possible for me, probably not for you starting out taking this. And so we really say go piece by piece, go question by question, even answer item by answer item. And that may be the way to keep it simple enough for you. The second thing that we're going to talk about a lot is process of elimination. This is a tremendous and just extremely helpful way to think about working on this test. It's actually in mathematical theory and scientific theory, it is much easier to disprove something than it is to prove something. And this is something we see borne out on the ACT multiple choice questions. It can frequently be very difficult to find the right answer of 4, but it is much easier to find a wrong answer, to point to exactly why it is wrong, cross it out, and then move on to a smaller selection of answers to choose from. So really practicing that a lot, even for questions that you know you can get right off the bat. Thinking through it, what can I eliminate and why? What can I eliminate and why? I could probably say that for this whole webinar. And if you just got that message, that would really, really help. What can I eliminate and why? The last thing to mention is that there's no right way to do this part of the ACT test. Flexibility, variety are key, as I have said here. What works for one student may not work for another student. So if you hear from your friend, oh, I've got the secret, I solved the mystery, I know how to do it. That may be true for your friend, for him or for her. It may not necessarily work for you. What I would advise is that you try it out. You try some different ways of doing it, try different ways, different orders, different approaches, see what works for you. The goal is to get to the end with as many questions right as possible, and there are many different ways of doing that. So now we've got this fun section. We are going to do this teach back. This is the first time we've done it in a webinar. It's exciting. It's been pretty cool. And we're going to start out with me as a student. Got my bespoke hat to play the student, though the beard may give it away. Sorry, folks. Riley, take it away.
Love it. And I apologize, I don't have a costume change for everybody else, but I love it. I love the hat. Awesome. Okay, yeah, we're gonna jump in as we would a normal session. So hi Dan, how you doing?
Hey Riley, pretty good, thanks.
Good, love the hat, looks great. We're gonna jump into a ACT science section today. Do you have your notebook for?
Yes, I do.
Great.
Yes, I do. Got my bespoke notebook right here.
Great. I'm gonna share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yep, I got it.
And then I'm gonna make sure you can see if I write something. So tell me what I've written.
Hi.
Awesome. Sounds great. Okay, so we've already gone through a couple of the ACT science passage types, but today we're going to talk about a new one. This is the conflicting viewpoints passage. So I want you to write that at the top of your notebook so you know where to get back to.
Got it. Conflicting viewpoints.
Awesome. Now, this one is one of the more time-consuming, not necessarily hard, just a time-consuming passage. So I want you to write down, my suggestion is we save this for last.
All right, got it.
One, because you can get some other points a little easier. Other places, time consuming, but also, in my opinion, this is kind of the most fun one. So it gives you something to look forward to at the end of the test. Great. Now, and we're going to do like a how-to step-by-step process on how to approach these. So step one, I know we've said not to do this in other passages, but for this one, I do suggest we read the introduction. So write that down. Step one.
Read the introduction. Got it. Okay, scientists discuss the possible causes of the mass extinction between 13 and 10,000 years ago of dozens of large mammal genera on the North American continent, including the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, the dire wolf, several bear species, and American horses, camels, and lions.
Great. Awesome.
All right.
Now, this just gives us sort of context what we're going to read coming up. Now, I just want you, step two, read just scientist one, only scientist one.
So not everything that they give me before the questions?
Nope, just scientist one and that paragraph.
Right. Cool. The mass extinction was caused by the migration of human hunters across the Bering Land Bridge to the continent known as the Clovis people. These Native American ancestors hunted large herbivores such as mammoths, mastodons, and ancient bison to extinction. This in turn caused the large carnivores and scavengers that depended upon these animals to become extinct from lack of prey.
Awesome, great.
All right.
Got that one read. Now I want you just to look through the questions and see if there's any that only refer to scientist one.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's like scanning it. Okay, question 26 is scientist two. Question 27 is a bunch of different scientists in the answer options. Question 28, a bunch of different scientists. Question 29, a bunch of different scientists. Question 30 is only scientist four. Question 31 is multiple scientists. Question 32 is 1 and 3. And then question 33 is a bunch of different scientists as well.
Okay, so do we see any in this that have just to do with scientist one?
No.
No, and that's okay. In this one, that didn't happen, but it might happen in other ones. So we still want to scan through, look for scientist one. However, we can still use it before we go back and read anyone else. Let's look for a question that has to do with scientist one and maybe just one other scientist.
Okay, well then I'm going to grab number 32 because it's just 1 and 3.
Great. What is 32 asking you?
Scientists 1 and 3 would most likely agree that, oh, cool. So it's like, because I already read 1, I can check it against 1 even without knowing 3.
Yeah, how do you know which of these answers you can eliminate?
Let's see. Okay, so F, American horses became extinct as a result of heat exhaustion. So scientist 1 didn't say anything about heat exhaustion. So
Right.
F has got to be wrong. American lions became extinct as a result of being hunted to extinction. No.
Okay, why not no on that?
Well, it's like, it's close, but he says G says the lions were hunted, but the scientist said that the herbivores were hunted.
Great, awesome. So yeah, we'll get rid of this one too.
Okay, H, dire wolves became extinct as a result of large wildfires. Wildfires didn't enter into scientist 1. And then this one is left, but it also is right. So, saber-toothed tigers became extinct as a result of starvation because all the herbivores got killed.
Yep, awesome, awesome. So we didn't even have to read scientist 3 in order to get this point, right?
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, awesome. So we can use that. We would go through, look for some other ones. Now let's go on to step 2. We just read scientist 1 last time, scan for scientist 1. What do you think step 2 is going to be?
Probably do the same thing for the next scientist.
Perfect. Let's do it for scientist 2.
Cool. Climate change was responsible for the mass extinction between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. A 6 degrees Celsius increase in global mean annual temperatures occurred. This temperature increase, which melted the ice sheet, placed intense thermal stress on cold-adapted mammals. The mammals' thick fur prevented the dumping of excess heat, causing them to die of heat exhaustion. Large mammals, with their reduced surface area to volume ratio, would have fared worse than small mammals.
Okay, what's my next step then?
Oh, so I'm just, it's like rinse and repeat. I'm just doing it for each scientist. Cool.
Perfect.
Oh, and here's one, number 26 is all about scientist 2. So let's do that one.
Okay.
Well, scientist 2 didn't say anything about the hunters, so I would cross off F.
Okay.
G, fur of small mammals was not adapted to cold climates. I don't know about that, because he did say stuff about fur and small mammals and cold climates. So I'm going to leave that one for now.
Great.
Bodies of small mammals had more surface area per unit volume. He definitely said that. I don't know if that's, well, let's keep on going. Small mammals were able to live in both grasslands and tundra. He didn't say anything about that.
Okay.
So I'd cross off J. And then I'm just comparing G and H. If I look back at 2,
So yeah, let's look back.
yeah, he doesn't actually say that the small mammals were not adapted.
Great. What sentence are you saying?
He says all the mammals' fur prevented the dumping of excess heat, but the large mammals would have fared worse than the small mammals.
Okay. Why did they say because of what? Was it the fur or something else?
Because of the surface area to volume ratio.
Great. So what do we think our correct answer is here?
So I would cross off G and select H.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, we're going to skip the next step, because what we did with scientist 1, looking for other ones that have to do with just 2 and something else for the sake of time. But what would be my next step? Imagine we had just
And
done.
I would read the next scientist 3.
Great. So let's do
Cool.
that.
So let me do that. Mass extinction was attributable to the dying off of mammals by human predation, climate change, or a combination of the 2. Mammoths played a key role in trampling the tundra and maintaining healthy grasslands in colder regions. When the mammoths became extinct, the tundra took over to the detriment of animals that relied on the grasslands, causing other large herbivores, along with the large carnivores and scavengers that fed on them, to perish as well. I kind of missed the point of that one, I think, as I read it.
Okay. So when we're looking at what the scientists are saying, I want you to ask the question to yourself, what are they saying was a cause and effect? Every scientist is going to try to give that. Where might we find the main point or the cause and effect the scientists?
Probably at the start of the hypothesis.
Great. Okay. Let's see if we can find that here.
Mass extinction was attributable to the dying off of mammoths by human. Okay, there it is. So
Great.
when I read it the first time, I just thought like mammals, but now I see he's talking specifically about mammoths. So the mammoths dying is the cause, the effect is that everybody else dies.
Perfect, yeah. And for those watching, Dan did it lovely right here, but I would ask Dan to put it in his own words what the thesis point is. And if we had found this problem earlier, I would also point out with scientist 1 or 2 that it tends to be at the beginning. Look for those thesis statements, put into your own words. For the sake of time, I think that'll be a good spot to end my lesson.
Thanks for the lesson, Riley.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to, of course, I want to point out to our audience that we're not, as we work on these questions, actually grappling with the meaning of really any of this stuff. I mean, I guess extinction, you got to know what that means. But I'm not trying to figure out what a mammal is or what a mammoth is or a surface area to volume ratio. I don't need to understand that to answer these questions correctly. What you're looking for is the reasoning. How does one thing relate or another thing relate? Another key piece of advice that I always come back to is that question, is it in the text? Is it in the text? If you can find where the information is pointed to or described in a piece of text in the passage setup, then you're on the right track. Do not interpret too much unless they're asking you to.
Well,
just
to add on to that a bit, when we worked on that question 26, one thing that I might say to a student in that situation as well is sometimes a student will feel like two answers might be right. And I say to my students, whenever you feel 2 answers might be right, one of them must be right. Right? And that's the sort of standard we have to hold our answers to in the ACT science section. They must be right. Somewhere there's a reason it's 100% correct.
Absolutely. So now we're going to do the other lesson, which is I'm going to be the tutor and Riley's going to be the student. Welcome, Riley. And what we are going to work from is a different passage type. So what we're looking at here on my screen, Riley, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Great. So this is a data representation passage. And it's worth noting that the stuff that Riley and I are sharing and the content that you see is all from the Bespoke Education ACT book, which we've been working on and updating for a long time. So this is where this stuff and these practice material is available. So Riley, we've talked a lot. You see a data representation passage. There's a lot going on. What, if any of it, do you look at first?
I'm not going to look at anything. I'm going to go
right
to the question.
That's exactly right. So all this stuff could be interesting, but the key is it's taking up too much time if you're trying to read it all and understand it all. So you're exactly right. You go straight to the questions. And we might talk on a later lesson about which questions you go to first, but in the interest of our lesson today, let's just say we see the first question, it's question 20. And so that's the one that we're going to tackle first. Riley, please read that question.
Okay, suppose that a projectile had been launched at an initial velocity of 75 meters per second at a launch angle of 80 degrees. Based on the results of table 1, flight time would most likely have been, and then all my answers.
We've got our answer options. Now, we've talked about looking piece by piece, controlling your focus. So I want to take this in two parts. First of all, where does the question ask us to look?
Table 1.
Great. Now, with some students, I might even cover up the other stuff. So I might cover this up or cover up table 2 so they don't even see it, where we're really trying to control what we are looking at. Now, let's go back to the question, the first sentence. And what I want you to do is read till you get to the first piece of meaningful information and then stop and work on that piece of information and nothing else.
Okay. Suppose that a projectile had been launched at an initial velocity of 75 meters per second. So
stop. Great. Good. So 75 meters per second, that's something useful. I'm going to underline it here, and we take that back to the table and we start working with it and figuring it out before we try to figure out anything else. So looking at the table, what do we got?
Well, initial velocity is in the second column.
There it is. And so I'm actually going to cover up height range, or sorry, maximum height and range, because we simply don't need to be thinking about them. And in this case, it's actually easier to solve this problem if you are looking at less. So initial velocity of 75, what I advise my students to do is mark up the section, put the 75 in where it should go, which in this case is above 22 and above 50. So now we go back to the question, what's the next piece of useful information?
At a launch angle of 80 degrees.
Great. So what column should that go into?
The first one.
Great. I'm going to fill that in. Over here, 80 degrees, launch velocity of 75. And then sure enough, what is the question asking us about?
The flight time.
Great. So we've got to make a prediction. Now, there are two different ways of doing this that I work through with my students. One is going from the answers to the data. One is going from the data or from the table back to the answers. Let's do it that second way for now. What's your prediction here, Riley? Just a ballpark of where this flight time is going to be related to the data that we're already seeing in that table.
Well, because the initial velocity is higher, so I'm going to say flight time is probably going to be higher.
Great. It's bigger than 10. And a key here is students might read this question and feel like they have to remember everything from physics and what are the equations for flight time or an object in free fall or something like that. No way. All we're looking for is very simple data extrapolation. So as we see it, when velocity goes up, flight time goes up. So the flight time has got to be more than 10. So what can we cross off from the answer options on number 20?
F and G, because those are too low.
And when I'm coaching my students, I go really strong on the crossing off. I don't even want to see the thing because if you look at it visually, it's actually easier now to choose and to differentiate between H and J. So Riley, what are we deciding between when we're trying to choose between H and J?
Between 10 and 20 or greater than 20. I mean, those are both bigger, and I don't know if I can fully roll out that it's not going to be.
Yeah, we
Greater
don't
than 20.
necessarily have the information right now, but as we've always said, the information is available if you know where to look. So we take a slightly more advanced method, or let's say tool, which is that when you are making changes in data, you only change one thing. So I'd ask you, Riley, which other trials have a launch angle of 80 degrees?
The one with the 22 isn't.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'm going to highlight these here. We've got this one, we've got this one, and we've got this one now that we're looking at. So let's look at those first two trials with 80 degrees and see if we can extrapolate anything from them. How much does the flight time go up when we increase the velocity from 22 to 50?
Oh, okay, so like 5.6.
Yep. So then let's make a prediction about how much more it might go up if we increase it to 75.
Oh, because it's like, oh, yeah, it's only going up like 25, which is kind of what it did last time. So I don't think it's going to double, more than double.
Right. That's
too much.
exactly right. It's not going to double if you're only increasing the velocity by about 1/2. So it just won't work. So which one should we select?
H.
Right. And that is the correct answer. So we're using some elimination. We're really looking very carefully back and forth and only looking at specific items from the table when we need them, not trying to understand the table as a whole, and certainly not going into the table and making predictions before we see the question. Because the question is going to tell you what you need to grapple with. You don't need to grapple with the whole thing. So now we would work through this. I'm going to show you some of the other questions. We've got a flight time question. We've got another table 1, another table 2. This one is a slightly more involved one, but in the interest of time, we're going to go on to this question, question 25, which is sort of a different kind of question, and it's dealing with a different part of this test material. So Riley, can you read question 25 for me?
Yeah. It is known that the surface gravity is 24.9 meters per second squared on Jupiter and 8.9 meters per second squared on Venus. Based on figure 2, if Pluto has a surface gravity of 0.58 meters per second squared, then the maximum height attained by an object launched at 80 degrees and 50 meters per second would likely be.
Okay, Riley, how do you feel reading this?
That's long. I've already forgotten.
Just
everything.
like what did I even read and why does it matter? I don't know.
Yeah.
So a key that we're going to talk about, Riley, as we keep working on the science section is read the question until you find where to look. And basically then stop and go to where you need to look, because anything more than that is probably going to be too confusing. So where does this question tell us to look?
Figure 2.
Great. So based on figure 2, I'm going to underline that. So we want to make sure we know what we're looking at. Sorry, I've got to swap the pages here, but here's figure 2. It's talking about the gravitational forces, the planets, and some curves. I'm not trying to understand it any more than that before I go back to the question and figure out what I've got to do next. So there's question 25. Riley, same thing we did before. How much do we read now to find something to grapple with?
Just till I find some number of data.
Yes, great. So take me through.
It is known that the surface gravity is 24.9 meters per second on Jupiter.
Yes.
Okay.
So we've got that. And what I might do, I mean, depending on my student's preference, I might take that back here, put in 24.9, just because that's relevant. Then what?
Then and it's 8.9 on Venus.
Right. So Venus is 8.9. And now here, before we do anything else, we've got to understand what this means for the chart that we're looking at.
Okay.
And a piece that I talk about with my students, Riley, you may remember from before, is we talk about correlation is when one thing goes up, does another thing go up? Or when one thing goes up, does another thing go down?
Mhm.
And that's a basic pattern of interaction for numbers in science that's going to be helpful here. So now let's think about these numbers, 24.9 for Jupiter, 8.9 for Venus. Let's think about them in relationship to these curves. Take me through it, please.
Well, so I guess Jupiter has the highest gravity and it has the lowest, like the smallest
Yeah.
arch, and then
So
Venus.
Jupiter's really big, but here it is, small, small curve. Now, what about Venus?
Really small number and it has the biggest.
Small number, and its curve is this top curve. So yeah, that's the Venus curve. So we are seeing some kind of inverse relationship here. When gravity goes up, the curve goes down. Now let's take it back to the question.
Well, okay, so then it's asking about Pluto,
Yep,
and that has a really, really small one.
tiny gravity, 0.58. Put that up
So-
here just so I can see it. I mean, that's just a fraction of 8.9. So where can we predict the curve is going to be?
Much bigger, much larger.
Much bigger. I don't really know, but higher than Venus, that's for sure.
Mhm.
Now let's take it back to the questions, or sorry, the answers.
Okay, so definitely not A or B. Those are going to be
Right, because